It happened in public, with civilians screaming, drinks shattering, a full-on mess. But even with all eyes on him, Gotti didn't flinch. He went underground, shielded by the very system he'd bled for. Still, by 1974, the law caught up. Gotti was arrested and charged with murder, but the case against him was soft. Witnesses got shaky, testimonies blurred. The mob's code of silence, and maybe a few threats, worked their magic. With Roy Cohn, Carlo Gambino's personal legal attack dog, whispering in courtroom shadows, Gotti's charge was downgraded to manslaughter. He did just 2 years. When Gotti walked out of prison, the streets noticed. He wasn't some no-name associate anymore. He was the guy who handled McBratney, the guy who took out a gangster who dared touch the Gambinos. He had earned the respect of Della Croce, and more importantly, he had earned the fear of everyone else. That hit marked him. It gave him credentials. In the underworld, bodies are currency, and Gotti had made his first major deposit. His reward? He was made. Inducted into the Gambino family as a full-fledged man of honor. And soon after, he was placed in command of the Bergen crew, based out of a storefront in Ozone Park, Queens. From there, Gotti built his empire brick by bloody brick. Before John Gotti became the Teflon Don, before the Brioni suits and front-page trials, he was just another soldier in the Gambino family. Hungry, loyal, and dangerous. The hit on James McBratney in 1973 would be his proving ground. A kill order soaked in blood and family honor, and Gotti executed it like a man who already saw himself sitting at the head of the table. McBratney wasn't his target, not originally. Gotti didn't know who killed Manny Gambino, but when the bosses pointed the finger at McBratney, it didn't matter. Gotti was handed a mission: make the Irish pay. His orders came through Neil Della Croce, the family's no-nonsense underboss and Gotti's future mentor. Della Croce liked the young thug from Howard Beach. He saw a fire in him, something old school, something ruthless. The Snoop's bar hit wasn't supposed to be a shooting. The plan was to abduct McBratney and bring him in for a more controlled execution. But McBratney, 6'4" and streetwise, didn't go quietly. As the fight erupted, Gotti and Angelo Ruggiero struggled to hold him. It was Ralph Gallioni, jittery and armed, who lost control, pulling the trigger and ending it with a double tap to the chest and skull. Gotti had to run. He left behind a trail of witnesses. He wasn't just seen, he was described. And this was no backroom hit. It happened in public, with civilians screaming, drinks shattering, a full-on mess. But even with all eyes on him, Gotti didn't flinch. He went underground, shielded by the very system he'd bled for. Still, by 1974, the law caught up. Gotti was arrested and charged with murder, but the case against him was soft. Witnesses got shaky, testimonies blurred. The mob's code of silence, and maybe a few threats, worked their magic. With Roy Cohn, Carlo Gambino's personal legal attack dog, whispering in courtroom shadows, Gotti's charge was downgraded to manslaughter. He did just 2 years. When Gotti walked out of prison, the streets noticed. He wasn't some no-name associate anymore. He was the guy who handled McBratney, the guy who took out a gangster who dared touch the Gambinos. He had earned the respect of Della Croce, and more importantly, he had earned the fear of everyone else. That hit marked him. It gave him credentials. In the underworld, bodies are currency, and Gotti had made his first major deposit. His reward? He was made. Inducted into the Gambino family as a full-fledged man of honor. And soon after, he was placed in command of the Bergen crew, based out of a storefront in Ozone Park, Queens. From there, Gotti built his empire brick by bloody brick. When Carlo Gambino died in 1976, it wasn't just a change of leadership. It was a rupture in the bloodline of American organized crime. Many assumed his longtime underboss, the cold-eyed killer Neil Della Croce, would ascend the throne. Instead, Carlo handed the reins of the Gambino family to his cousin and brother-in-law, Paul Castellano. A decision that sent a ripple of fury through the street crews. Paul wasn't a man of the street. He was a businessman who preferred tailored suits over bloodied hands, spreadsheets over silencers. From his palatial estate on Tot Hill, a gleaming white mansion perched on the heights of Staten Island, Castellano ruled not with fear, but with contracts, monopolies, and political insulation. He called it home. The press called it the White House. His soldiers called it something else. The ivory tower of a boss who had forgotten the alleyways that built the empire. But Paul hadn't forgotten the streets. He simply thought they were beneath him. He transformed the family into a corporate syndicate, pushing deeper into legitimate industries. Construction, poultry distribution, concrete, sanitation. Through his company Dial Poultry, Castellano supplied nearly every chicken wing that landed on a plate in New York City. He didn't extort the unions, he owned them. And at the heart of his concrete racket was a quiet partnership with the Genovese family, particularly Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, who fronted their operations while the real power, Vincent the Chin Gigante, played lunatic in a bathrobe on Sullivan Street, avoiding indictment by pretending to talk to parking meters. Together, Castellano and Salerno built a cartel-like grip over the construction world. If you wanted to pour concrete in Manhattan, especially for projects over $2 million, you paid them. Not in cash, but in obedience. Paul's downfall, however, wouldn't come from a competitor or a prosecutor. It would come from his own indulgences, his own arrogance, and a Colombian maid who became something far more dangerous than a housekeeper. Her name was Gloria Olarte. She was quiet, devout, hired to clean floors and dust furniture. But within months, she was Castellano's lover, slipping into his bed and, eventually, into his trust. He confided in her as if she were part of the commission itself. He spoke freely about money, murders, men. She was the ear that heard everything. What neither of them knew was that the FBI was also listening. In 1983, agents managed to install a wiretap on Castellano's home telephone. Later, they slipped a bug into the chandelier above his dining room table, where he held private meetings and barked orders between bites of veal and sips of wine. It was Gloria who helped the feds understand the rhythm of the house, when Paul was home, who he spoke to, and how loudly he spoke. What they captured was a treasure trove. Castellano discussing Gambino business. Castellano confirming connections to extortion rings. Castellano, perhaps worst of all, referring to loyal capos like John Gotti and Angelo Ruggiero as animals, street trash, filth beneath his polished shoes. All of it would become part of a sweeping, unprecedented legal assault. By 1985, U.S. Attorney Rudy Giuliani had launched the commission case, a federal nuclear strike against the leadership of all 5 families. For the first time, the U.S. government was formally charging the Mafia as an organized criminal corporation. Not just the killers, not just the earners, the bosses. Castellano, Salerno, Persico, Corallo, Rastelli, all named as co-defendants in a single RICO case. The recordings from Castellano's dining room, along with FBI bugs placed in the Palma Boys social club used by the Genovese family, provided the backbone of the indictment. But Paul still believed he was untouchable. He had the lawyers, the reputation, and the insulation of a legitimate businessman. He wouldn't even show up to commission meetings in person, often sending messengers in his place. Another slight that infuriated men like Gotti, who had bled for this life and wanted a leader who remembered what blood cost. Inside the family, resentment boiled. Castellano's refusal to elevate Gotti after Della Croce's illness, his disdain for the drug trade even as his crews profited from it, and his obsession with his mistress while the FBI practically lived in his living room. All of it made him look weak. Worse, it made him look vulnerable. And in the Mafia, a vulnerable boss doesn't last. December 16, 1985. Manhattan was dressed in winter's hush, the streets glazed in frost, the city moving with holiday restraint. Christmas lights blinked across storefronts, traffic crept along 46th Street, and outside Sparks Steakhouse, a few pedestrians waited for cabs or shuffled past without a thought. They had no idea they were standing on the edge of Mafia history. Inside a Lincoln town car rolling through Midtown sat Paul Castellano, flanked by his new underboss, Thomas Bellotti, a brutal enforcer more pitbull than diplomat. Castellano was dressed immaculately, as always, his overcoat pressed, tie tight. He wasn't going for dinner. He was going to a meeting, a sit-down with several high-ranking captains. The purpose, Paul believed, was to settle nerves, reassure everyone he still had control, and, if needed, squash whispers about indictments and street rumors. What he didn't know was that some of the men he was planning to reassure had already decided he had to die. For weeks, John Gotti and his loyalists had been orchestrating the hit with surgical precision. Gotti had grown tired of Paul's arrogance, his detachment, his refusal to recognize the soldiers who were doing the real work, his work. Castellano had humiliated Gotti by ignoring Della Croce's death just 2 weeks earlier. No call, no tribute, no respect. Gotti took it personally, so he took action. He met quietly with fellow captains Frank DeCicco and Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano. They weighed the risks. Killing a sitting boss violated Mafia code, unless you had commission approval. But Gotti didn't ask. He knew men like Vincent the Chin Gigante and Fat Tony Salerno would never greenlight such an act, especially not against a partner in their multi-million-dollar concrete cartel. So Gotti made a choice that would define the rest of his life. Do it anyway. The shooters were hand-picked, experienced, silent, cold. They were told exactly where Castellano would be, what time he'd arrive, what he would be wearing. Gotti himself parked nearby, sitting in a getaway car with Gravano, watching from a distance like a director at the edge of a movie set. He wanted to see the curtain fall. At 5:26 p.m., Castellano's black Lincoln pulled up in front of Sparks Steakhouse. He opened the door. Before he could step fully onto the sidewalk, 4 men in trench coats and Russian hats approached from the shadows. No words, no warning, just gunfire. Castellano was shot 6 times in the chest and face. He fell backward onto the pavement, eyes wide, mouth frozen in a final moment of confusion. Bilotti, still inside the car, reached for the door and was gunned down before he could shout a word. The snow drank the blood quickly, and within 30 seconds, both men were dead. The hit team melted into the crowd, vanishing into side streets and subway entrances. Tourists screamed. Waiters ducked. Blood pooled on the sidewalk where the most powerful boss in America had just been executed like a 2-bit loan shark. Gotti lit a cigarette and watched from a safe distance. Then he pulled the car into traffic and disappeared into the Manhattan evening. The hit stunned the Mafia world. Never in modern Cosa Nostra history had a family boss been taken out so publicly, so flagrantly, without approval. But the truth was clear. Paul Castellano had lost the respect of the streets, and John Gotti had just claimed the crown. Not in a backroom vote, but in gunfire, in front of the press, the police, and all of New York. And in that moment, the Gambino family wasn't just under new management. It had a new king.